Should have just closed up and gone home when I told you to. Would have saved us both the trouble." Officer Jude Anson snapped the handcuffs onto Dorothy Dot Addison's wrists like she was nothing. Like 74 years of her life amounted to an inconvenience in his parking lot. Miss Dot did not struggle, did not beg, did not give him a single thing he was looking for. 74 years old, cane gone, wrists pinned, and she still walked straighter than he ever had. What Jude Anson did not know was that the woman he had just put in the back of his cruiser had spent many years collecting debts of gratitude from this town, and every single one of them was about to come due. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The boxes weren't going to unload themselves. Dorothy Addison knew that. So at 6:45 in the morning, while most of Clover Ridge, Georgia was still hitting the snooze button, she was already at the community center. Keys in hand, cane tapping the concrete, unlocking the front doors the same way she had every Tuesday for 19 years. People called her Miss Dot. Everyone did. Her students, their children, their children's children. The mailman, the mayor. It didn't matter how old you were or where you came from. In Clover Ridge, she was simply Miss Dot, and that name carried weight. She was 74 years old, and she moved like she knew it. Deliberate, careful, but never slow. There was a difference. She wore a pressed blue blouse and her good walking shoes, the ones with the thick soles her doctor had recommended after the knee surgery 3 years back. Her hair was white and neat. Her eyes were dark and sharp. They didn't miss a thing. By 7:30, the parking lot was alive. 6 volunteers worked the delivery line, passing boxes hand to hand from the back of a donated truck. Canned goods, fresh bread, produce that the grocery store on 5th Street set aside every Monday night just for them. Miss Dot stood just inside the entrance and directed traffic the way she used to run her classroom. Calm, clear, and completely in charge. "Lucas, those greens go in the back cooler, not up front," she said, without looking up from her clipboard. "And somebody prop that door open before we all sweat to death in here." Lucas, not Reverend Lucas, just Lucas when he was doing grunt work, grinned and did as he was told. He was her nephew. 48 years old with a pastor's collar and his aunt's eyes. He had learned a long time ago that arguing with Miss Dot was a waste of perfectly good energy. The Clover Ridge Community Center had stood on the corner of Red Bud Lane and 4th Street since 1962. Oscar Addison had built the first room with his own 2 hands and the help of 12 men from their congregation. He used to say the building wasn't about brick and mortar. It was about what happened inside it. Oscar had been gone for 7 years now. Heart attack, right there in the kitchen, on a Thursday afternoon. Miss Dot had held his hand, until the ambulance came. She had buried him, grieved him, and then gotten up the next morning and opened the community center. Because that was what Oscar would have wanted. And because 72 families in this part of Clover Ridge depended on Thursday's food distribution to get through the week. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because it needed doing. "Miss Dot!" A small voice shot across the parking lot like a bottle rocket. She turned. Running toward her, arms pumping, sneakers slapping the pavement, was a little girl named Gracie, 7 years old, white as a sheet and skinny as a rail, from the trailer park 2 blocks down on Wheeler Road. She came every Tuesday with her grandmother to pick up the weekly groceries. Miss Dot opened her arms. Gracie hit her like a wave. "Good morning, baby." Miss Dot laughed, low and warm, and smoothed the girl's tangled hair. "You eat breakfast?" "Grandma made oatmeal," Gracie said, making a face. "Oatmeal is good for you. It tastes like paste." "Well," Miss Dot straightened up, fighting a smile. "Maybe we'll find you something better in those boxes." Gracie took off toward the volunteers. Miss Dot watched her go. This was the job. This right here. It wasn't glamorous. There were no cameras, no plaques on the wall, no one handing out awards. Just boxes and coolers, and people who needed help, and a woman who showed up every single week to make sure they got it. Councilman David Elwood pulled into the lot around 9 o'clock, stopped to shake Miss Dot's hand, told her she was a treasure, and drove off to his next meeting. She thanked him. She meant it. But she wasn't doing this for David Elwood either. She was doing it for Gracie, for the families lined up quietly inside, for Oscar. That was enough. The morning moved along easy and warm, the way good Tuesdays do in a small town. Birds, voices, the occasional laugh drifting out through the propped open doors. Miss Dot didn't hear the engine at first. Too much noise, too much life. But then the lot went just a little quieter, the way it does when something feels wrong. She looked up. A police cruiser was rolling slowly through the entrance. No lights, no hurry. It eased to a stop near the edge of the lot, and the engine kept running. Just sitting there, idling. Nobody got out. The volunteers kept working, but something had shifted. A few of them glanced toward the cruiser, then back at each other. Nobody said anything. They just moved a little slower, the way people do when they suddenly feel watched. Miss Dot stood still and looked at that car. She couldn't see the driver clearly through the windshield, just a shape, a silhouette behind the glass. But the car itself told her plenty. The way it had rolled in with no urgency. The way it had stopped without pulling all the way in. The way it just sat there, engine running, like it was in no rush at all, like it was waiting for her to notice it. Her hand tightened around the grip of her cane. Something is coming, she thought. She didn't know what yet, but in 74 years of living, she had learned one thing for certain. Trouble never announces itself. It just idles. The car door opened. The man who stepped out wasn't tall, but he carried himself like he thought he was. Broad through the shoulders. Dark uniform pressed neat. His hair was cut short on the sides, and he had the kind of face that had probably been handsome once before something mean settled into it permanently. He reached back into the cruiser and pulled out a clipboard. No radio call had brought him here. No emergency. No complaint from anyone in the neighborhood. Miss Dot knew that without asking. She had lived in Clover Ridge long enough to know what a man on official business looked like and what a man on personal business looked like. This was personal. He walked toward her slowly, eyes moving across the parking lot first, taking in the volunteers, the truck, the boxes, like he was cataloging everything, like he was building a case just by looking. His name tag read Anson in black block letters. "Morning," he said, not warmly. "Officer." Miss Dot didn't move from her spot near the entrance. She kept her hands on her cane and her eyes on his face. Anson held up the clipboard. On it was a printed form. Official city letterhead. Lots of small text. A red stamp across the top that read, "Notice of Violation." "Got a code issue here," he said, loud enough for everyone in the parking lot to hear. He wasn't talking just to her. He was performing. City Ordinance 14-31 prohibits the storage and distribution of commercial quantities of perishable goods from a non-commercial zoned property. He tapped the clipboard with one finger. "This facility is in violation." Miss Dot looked at him for a moment. Then she said evenly, "I've never heard of that ordinance." "Well," Anson smiled, "now you have. How old is it?" He paused, just barely. "It's on the books." "That's what matters." It was 2 weeks old. Miss Dot didn't know that yet, not exactly, but she could smell freshly printed law from a mile away. 31 years in a classroom had taught her the difference between a rule that existed to help people and a rule that existed to hurt them. "I have been feeding this community for 19 years, she said. Her voice was steady, quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a room. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, 19 years without a single complaint from this city or anyone in it. Well, things change." Anson clicked his pen. "You've got 48 hours to cease food distribution operations or bring the facility into compliance. After that, I'll have no choice but to take further action." He said it like he was reading from a script, like he'd rehearsed it on the drive over. "I'd hate for this to become a bigger problem than it needs to be." The words landed in the parking lot like something dropped from a height. Nobody moved. The volunteers had stopped working. They were all watching now, 6 of them standing in the sun with boxes in their arms, not sure whether to put them down or keep holding on. 2 of them had their phones out. Neither one was being subtle about it. Anson noticed. He didn't seem to care. Miss Dot looked at the clipboard. Then she looked at the man holding it. She had taught hundreds of children in her career, and she had learned early that there were 2 kinds of people who hid behind authority. There were people who genuinely believed in the rules, and there were people who used rules the way a bully uses size, not to enforce anything, but to make someone feel small. She knew exactly which kind she was looking at. "You have a good morning, Officer Anson," she said. It wasn't surrender. The way she said it made that perfectly clear. It was dismissal. Something flickered across Anson's face. Irritation, quickly buried. He clicked his pen one more time, tucked the clipboard under his arm, and walked back to his cruiser without hurrying. He got in. He pulled out of the lot the same slow way he'd come in. Miss Dot watched until the car turned the corner and disappeared. Then she turned to her volunteers. Every single one of them was looking at her. "Those greens aren't going to sort themselves," she said. They got back to work, but her hand, wrapped around the top of her cane, was trembling. Not from fear. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. Not fear. Something hotter than that. Something that had been burning in the chest of every person who had ever been told to sit down and accept it. She walked inside and stood at Oscar's old desk for a moment. The surface was clean, organized, a place for everything and everything in its place. The way Oscar had always kept it, and the way she had kept it since. She pulled out the small notebook she carried in her blouse pocket and wrote down 3 things: the officer's name, the ordinance number he had cited, and the words 48 hours. She underlined all 3. Then she set the notebook down, picked up the phone, and dialed. Lucas answered on the second ring. "I need you to come down here," she said. "We've got a problem." Lucas came down quickly from the second floor. He had been up there during the whole thing, sorting donated clothing in the storage room above the main hall. He hadn't seen Anson from up there, but the parking lot had gone quiet in a way that travels through walls, and Lucas had learned a long time ago to pay attention to sudden quiet. He came down the back staircase and found Miss Dot in the small office off the main hall, already sitting behind Oscar's desk with her notebook open in front of her. She had written 2 pages of notes before he reached the bottom step. She told him everything anyway. The cruiser rolling in without a call, the ordnance, the clipboard, the way Anson had said it loud enough for everyone to hear, the way he had smiled when he said it. Lucas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Let me make some calls." That evening, he called 3 city council members. 2 of them went straight to voicemail. The third, a man named Patterson, who had shaken Miss Dot's hand at every church fundraiser for 15 years, picked up on the 4th ring and spent 6 minutes saying absolutely nothing in the most reassuring way possible. He used words like, "look into it," and "make sure the right people are aware," and These things take time. Lucas thanked him. He hung up. He did not feel thankful. Miss Dot called the community legal aid office herself that same evening. The woman who answered was kind and clearly overworked. She took notes, promised someone would follow up within 3 to 5 business days, and gave Miss Dot an after-hours voicemail number to call if the situation escalated. 3 to 5 business days. The 48 hours would be up Thursday morning. That night, Miss Dot sat at her kitchen table alone and spread out every document she could find relating to the community center. Operating records, donation logs, the church's original deed to the land going back to 1962, Oscar's handwritten ledgers from the first decade, careful columns of numbers in his steady, looping script. She read through all of it, not because she was scared, because she believed in being ready. Wednesday came and went quietly. No cruiser, no Anson, no phone call from the city. The community center opened on schedule, and Miss Dot ran the Tuesday volunteer session with a Wednesday crew, sorting donations, restocking shelves, preparing for Thursday's food distribution. She did not tell the volunteers about the violation notice. She did not want them frightened, and she did not want the Thursday families frightened either. 72 households were counting on those doors being open in the morning. By Wednesday evening, the 48 hours were almost gone. Lucas came by after his last pastoral visit and found her in the office again, this time cross-referencing the land deed with the city zoning records she had pulled from the county website. "Aunt Dot." He sat down across from her. "I've been thinking." She looked up. "Maybe, just for now, it makes sense to pause Thursday's distribution, just until we get some legal clarity. A week, maybe 2, just so we're not giving them a reason to escalate." Miss Dot set down her pen. She looked at her nephew for a long moment. He was a good man, a careful man, a man who had spent his whole pastoral career trying to find peaceful paths through hard situations. She loved him for it, and she understood exactly what he was suggesting and exactly why. But she thought about the families on the Thursday list. She kept that list in a folder in the top left drawer of Oscar's desk, and she knew every name on it. She knew which households had children. She knew which ones had elderly members living on fixed incomes. She knew which families had been coming since the very first year, and which ones had started coming only recently because things had gotten harder and they had nowhere else to turn. "Lucas," she said, "if I close those doors Thursday, I'm telling every one of those families that some man with a clipboard matters more than they do." She picked her pen back up. "I'm not doing that." Lucas opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He had known this woman his entire life, and he recognized when a conversation was finished. "Then I'll be here at 6:30, he said. "6, she said. "We'll have more to set up than usual." He nodded, pushed back his chair, and kissed her on the top of her head before he left. Miss Dot sat at the desk for another hour after he was gone. She added 3 more pages to her notebook. She reviewed the land deed one more time. She turned off the light at 10:15, locked up, and drove home. She did not sleep much. But when Thursday morning came, gray and still and quiet before sunrise, she was already dressed. She was the first one to arrive at the community center. She unlocked the front doors herself. Thursday morning moved the way Miss Dot had planned it. Lucas was there at 6, same as she'd asked. The two of them worked side by side in the early quiet, pulling folding tables from the storage room, setting up the distribution line, checking the coolers. By 8:30, 4 volunteers had arrived. By 9:15, the first families were already waiting outside, lined up along the sidewalk the way they always did, patient and familiar. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. At 10:15, 2 cruisers pulled in. Not 1 this time. 2. They came in together and parked directly in front of the entrance, bumper to bumper, blocking the path between the building and the street. Anson stepped out of the first car. A second officer, younger, thicker through the jaw, eyes that stayed on the ground, climbed out of the other. The families in line went still. Anson didn't look at them. He walked straight toward Miss Dot, who was standing at the front entrance the same way she had been standing there for 19 years, cane in hand, back straight, not moving. "Ma'am?" He held up a folded document. "Cease and desist order, issued this morning by the city. Food distribution operations are to halt immediately pending full compliance review." He said it fast, clipped, like he'd been practicing it too. "I'm going to need you to close the facility." Miss Dot looked at the paper. She did not take it. "Do you have a court order compelling me to close this building?" she asked. "I have a city-issued cease and desist." "That is not what I asked you." Her voice was level. "Do you have a court order?" Anson's jaw tightened. "I'm asking you to comply with a lawful city directive." "And I'm telling you," Miss Dot said, "that without a court order, you do not have the authority to close this building. These people are here for food. I am not turning them away." She looked past him at the families still waiting along the sidewalk. A young mother near the front was holding a toddler on her hip. An elderly man with a cane much like Miss Dot's own stood 2 people behind her. "Not today. Not for you." Something shifted in Anson's face. The performance dropped away. What was underneath it was worse. "Dorothy Addison," he said, and now his voice had an edge to it that hadn't been there before, hard and satisfied. "You are being placed under arrest for obstruction of a lawful order and failure to comply with a city directive." He stepped forward. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The parking lot made a sound. Not words, just a collective intake of breath from every person standing in it. "You are arresting me," Miss Dot said. It wasn't a question. She said it clearly, deliberately, loud enough for every single person present to hear every single word. "You are arresting a 74-year-old woman for feeding people. I'm arresting you for obstruction." Anson moved behind her. She did not fight him. She did not pull away. She stood straight and let him take her cane from her hand and pass it to the second officer. She let him guide her wrists together behind her back. She felt the cold metal of the handcuffs close. One click, then another, and she breathed through it. 3 phones were recording. She could see them in her peripheral vision. Nobody tried to hide it. Nobody lowered their arm. Anson walked her to the cruiser with a hand on her elbow, guiding her across the parking lot in front of everyone. The volunteers, the families, the toddler on the young mother's hip, the old man with the cane, all of them watching in silence. At the car door, Miss Dot turned her head and looked back at her volunteers. All of them. She found their faces one by one. "Don't you close those doors," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "You keep feeding people." The door closed. The cruiser pulled out of the lot slowly, the same unhurried way it had arrived, and turned the corner onto 4th Street. And then it was gone. The parking lot held its silence for 3 full seconds. Then someone was crying. Then someone else. Then Lucas, who had watched the whole thing from just inside the entrance, walked to the center of the parking lot, put his hands on his knees, and stayed like that for a moment before he straightened up and looked at the volunteers. "You heard her," he said quietly. "Let's keep going." In the back of the lot, a young woman named Brianna, 23 years old, a volunteer for 2 years, stood with her phone still raised. Her hands were shaking. She opened Facebook. She typed 6 words. "They arrested our Miss Dot." She pressed post. Brianna's post had 40 views when she first checked it. Then 400. Then 4,000. She stood in the community center parking lot and watched the number climb the way you watch a storm come in. Fast and dark and bigger than you expected. By the time Lucas locked up at noon and sent the last volunteer home, the video had crossed 40,000 views and was still climbing. Inside the police department, Miss Dot was processed the way they process everyone. Fingerprints, photograph, a plastic bag for her personal items, her watch, her small notebook, the reading glasses from her blouse pocket. A female officer did the intake without making eye contact. Miss Dot answered every question clearly and did not volunteer anything extra. She had taught civics for 31 years. She knew her rights the same way she knew her multiplication tables. She was placed in a holding area and given a paper cup of water she didn't drink. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and waited. By 2 in the afternoon, the video had 200,000 views. The comment section had become a war. News alerts were being generated by outlets in Atlanta, Birmingham, and Charlotte. A producer at a cable news network had already sent an inquiry email to the Clover Ridge Police Department's public information address. At 4:30, a bailiff came to tell Miss Dot her case had been assigned to Judge Nick Felton for a bond hearing. Nick Felton was 45 years old. He had grown up 3 blocks from the community center. Miss Dot had taught him in 7th and 8th grade and had written his college recommendation letter in 1997. He still had the letter. It was framed in his home office. The hearing lasted 11 minutes. Judge Felton set no bond. Release on her own recognizance. His face gave nothing away, but when the paperwork was done and the session was closed, he paused before leaving the bench and said, to no one in particular, "Court is adjourned." He said it like it meant something else entirely. Miss Dot walked out of the Clover Ridge Police Department at 6:03 in the evening. The crowd outside stopped her cold. Not because she was afraid of them, because there were so many. 80 people, maybe more, spread across the sidewalk and into the parking lot. Neighbors, former students, families from the Thursday distribution line, deacons from 3 different churches, 2 representatives from the local NAACP chapter with a handwritten sign that read, "We see you, Miss Dot." Someone had brought flowers. Someone else had brought a folding chair, apparently concerned she would need to sit down. She didn't sit down. Lucas was at the front of the crowd. He reached her first and took both her hands in his and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "How were the numbers today?" He almost laughed. "We served 68 families." "Good." A woman near the back of the crowd started clapping. It spread. Miss Dot stood on the steps of the police department in the early evening light, 74 years old and just released from custody, and received it with her chin up and her shoulders back. She was not going to cry in front of the Clover Ridge Police Department. Not today. A young woman pushed through the crowd toward her, tall, natural hair pulled back, dressed in the kind of clothes that said she had driven a long way and not had time to change. She was maybe 35, 38, with sharp eyes and a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. "Miss Dot." She extended her hand. "My name is Stella Glover. I don't know if you remember me. I was in your class in 1999. I drove up from Atlanta this afternoon." Miss Dot looked at her, studied her face. "Stella Glover, you wrote your final paper on Thurgood Marshall." Stella blinked. "You remember that?" "I remember all of them." Miss Dot shook her hand. "What do you do now, baby?" "Civil rights law." Stella held up the portfolio. "And I'd like to help you, if you'll let me. These charges won't survive a motion to dismiss. I can have them gone within a week." For the first time since Tuesday morning, something loosened in Miss Dot's chest. Captain Winfield released a written statement at 7 p.m. 3 careful paragraphs about the department, reviewing the circumstances of the arrest, and remaining committed to community partnership. The council member who had pushed through the food storage ordinance stopped answering his phone entirely. The video hit 400,000 views before midnight. Miss Dot was home by 8, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she actually drank this time, when Lucas called. "The attorney seems good," he said. "She's excellent," Miss Dot said. "I always knew she would be." A pause. Then Lucas said, "There's one more call I want to make tonight." Miss Dot waited. "Ray Lagman," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Make your call, Lucas." She hung up. Lucas dialed. Across town, in the back of a motorcycle repair shop that smelled like engine oil and old coffee, a phone rang on a workbench cluttered with parts. Big Ray Lagman wiped the grease from his hands with a shop rag, looked at the screen, and answered. Big Ray didn't say hello when he answered. He just said, "Lucas, the way you say someone's name when you already know the call isn't casual." Ray. Lucas was sitting in the front pew of his church, the lights low, the building empty. He had gone there to make this call because some conversations need a certain kind of quiet around them. "I need to tell you what happened today." He told him everything. From the beginning. The cruiser on Tuesday. The clipboard. The 48 hours. The arrest that morning. The handcuffs. The parking lot full of witnesses. The families in line. The way Miss Dot had turned back and told her volunteers to keep the doors open. Big Ray listened without making a sound. When Lucas finished, the line was quiet for long enough that Lucas checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Big Ray said, "I saw the video." Another pause. "I've been sitting here looking at it for 2 hours. His voice was low and even, the way a river sounds when it's deep. Reynold Lagman was 61 years old and built like something that had been assembled for endurance rather than speed. His hands were large and scarred from decades of mechanical work. His forearms were covered in faded tattoos that told the story of his life in no particular order. He had a gray beard and a face that had taken some weather over the years and come out the other side harder than it started. Most people who didn't know him were afraid of him on sight. Most people who did know him understood that was precisely the wrong reaction. He had not always been the man he was now. There had been a version of Reynold Lagman, young, furious, fatherless, careening toward a life that ended either in a cell or a ditch, who might have become something much worse. That version of him had been stopped by a 7th-grade English teacher in 1974. He had been 13 years old and enormous for his age, already failing 3 classes, already in trouble twice with the vice principal, already carrying the particular anger of a boy who had learned early that the world was not arranged in his favor. His father had left when he was 4. His mother worked doubles at the textile mill and came home gray with exhaustion. Reynold had decided, with the quiet certainty of a child who has been failed by enough adults, that school was not for him. He had 3 weeks left before he planned to stop going entirely. Miss Dorothy Addison, 26 years old, first year of teaching, smaller than half her students, kept him after class on a Wednesday afternoon in October. He expected a lecture. He had his response ready. She didn't lecture him. She put a book on the desk in front of him and sat down across from him and said, "I think you understand more than you let on. I think you've decided it's safer to pretend you don't. I'd like to find out if I'm right." Nobody had ever said anything like that to him in his life. He came back the next Wednesday, and the one after that. She tutored him twice a week for the rest of the year. He passed 7th grade. He passed 8th. He didn't become a scholar. That was never the point. The point was that one person had looked at him and seen something worth the trouble. He never forgot it. She came to his mother's funeral in 1987. She was the only teacher who came. She sat in the 3rd pew and stayed for the whole service, and pressed his hand afterward without saying anything, because she understood that sometimes words are the smaller thing. In 2019, when the Hells Angels Charter raised $40,000 for a veterans' housing fund through their annual charity ride, he found a card in the mail a week later. Her handwriting, 3 lines. Oscar would have loved this. So would your mother. Keep going. Miss Dot. He had kept the card. It was in his desk drawer right now, in the back of the shop, 15 feet from where he was standing. What do you need, Lucas? He said. Lucas hesitated. I don't want any trouble, Ray. I thought you should know. I know. A pause. What do you need? I don't know exactly. She shouldn't be alone in this. She's not. Big Ray was already reaching for his jacket. How many you want? I'm not asking you to. How many? Lucas was quiet. Enough that he understands. Understood. Big Ray pulled the jacket on one arm at a time. Tell Miss Dot to sleep easy tonight. He hung up and began making calls. Short ones, same message every time. Saturday morning, 7 a.m., Clover Ridge PD. Cuts on, bikes out, no weapons, no words. By 10 o'clock, Friday night, 50 members of the Hells Angels MC had confirmed. Across Clover Ridge, in garages and driveways, and a long gravel lot behind the repair shop, engines were checked, chains were tightened, tanks were filled. Saturday was coming. Saturday morning came in gray and cool, the kind of morning that feels like it's holding its breath. At 6:55, the sound started at the edge of town. Low at first, a rumble that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Then, louder. Then louder still, rolling down Main Street and through the quiet residential blocks like something unstoppable and patient. Porch lights clicked on. Curtains moved. A man in a bathrobe stepped out onto his front steps with a coffee mug and stood watching with his mouth slightly open. 2 children pressed their faces flat against a living room window, eyes wide, as 50 motorcycles rolled past in a slow and perfect line. The Hells Angels did not rush. They did not rev their engines or ride aggressive. They moved through Clover Ridge the way a river moves, with total calm and total certainty, because a river doesn't need to announce where it's going. They turned onto Division Street at 7 o'clock exactly. The Clover Ridge Police Department sat on the corner of Division and Marsh, a flat brick building with a small parking lot, a flagpole out front, and a row of glass windows along the front wall that looked out onto the street. 2 reporters were already there, standing on the public sidewalk across from the entrance. They had received anonymous tips the night before. They had their cameras ready. A teenager named Sean, 17 years old, lived in the apartment building directly across the street. He had seen the notification about the Hells Angels on a neighborhood Facebook group at midnight and set his alarm for 6:30. He was on his balcony now with his phone raised, already live. The 50 bikes pulled into formation in front of the police department with the slow, deliberate precision of people who had discussed exactly how this would go. They arranged themselves in a wide semicircle facing the building's entrance, 5 rows deep, 10 bikes across at the widest point. The engines kept running, low, steady. Big Ray took the center position. He sat on his bike with both hands resting on the handlebars and his eyes fixed on the front door of the building. He did not look at the cameras. He did not look at the reporters. He did not look at Sean on the balcony across the street. He just waited. Inside the precinct, 6 officers stood at the front windows. Nobody said anything. One of them picked up an internal phone, put it back down, picked it up again. At 7:03, a car pulled into the lot. Anson's personal vehicle, a dark blue pickup, not the cruiser. He had the early shift. He parked in his usual spot near the side entrance, out of habit, and got out with his coffee travel mug in one hand and his keys in the other. He was already looking at his phone. He heard the engines before he saw anything. A wall of sound, low and constant. He looked up. He stopped. He stood in the parking lot of the Clover Ridge Police Department, and he looked at 50 men on 50 motorcycles arranged in a perfect arc in front of the building he worked in. And for a moment, his face did something it very rarely did. It went blank. His eyes moved across the row, counting, processing, and then they found Big Ray at the center. Big Ray, who had not moved, who was not moving, who was simply sitting there on his bike with his hands on the handlebars and his eyes locked on Anson's face, with an expression that was not angry, not threatening, not anything you could put a word to easily. It was just completely, absolutely certain. Anson stood there. 1 second, 2, 5, 10. The cameras caught all of it. Sean's live stream caught all of it. The 17 seconds that Officer Jude Anson stood frozen in that parking lot, coffee mug in hand, keys dangling, unable to move, and unable to pretend he wasn't unable to move, would be watched by 3 million people before the weekend was over. Then Anson took 1 step back. Then another. He got back in his truck, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot the same way he came in. Nobody followed him. Nobody needed to. The Hells Angels sat for another 10 minutes. Then, one by one, in the same patient order they had arrived, they rode away. By noon, it was on national news. By evening, Anson's face was everywhere. That afternoon, Stella was at her laptop in the community center's back office when her phone rang. She answered, listened, and went very still. Something in the municipal records had just changed everything. Stella didn't say much on the phone. She said, "Yes," twice, said, "Send it to me now," and hung up. Then she sat at the desk in the community center's back office and stared at her laptop screen while the email loaded. When it did, she opened the attached documents one by one and read through each of them with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who has learned that the most important details always hide in the language that nobody expects you to read. She read for 40 minutes without stopping. By the time she was done, her coffee was cold and her jaw was tight. She called Miss Dot. They gathered in the main hall that evening, Miss Dot, Lucas, and Stella, at the long folding table nearest the window. Outside, the parking lot was empty and dark. The community center was quiet in the way it only gets after hours, when the work of the day has settled, and the building holds it like a breath. Stella spread the documents across the table. Printed pages, a city zoning map with sections highlighted in yellow, a scanned letter on official city letterhead. "I want to walk you through this carefully," she said, "because it's important that you understand exactly what we're dealing with." Miss Dot folded her hands on the table. "Go ahead." Stella started from the beginning. 6 months ago, the city of Clover Ridge had quietly rezoned a 12-block corridor running along 4th Street, including the block the community center sat on, from residential community to mixed-use commercial. The rezoning had been approved by a city council subcommittee, a subcommittee that had met on a Thursday evening in November, with 4 days public notice during the week of Thanksgiving. Attendance at the meeting had been 11 people, including the 4 subcommittee members themselves. 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks before Anson first appeared in the community center parking lot with his clipboard, the city of Clover Ridge had accepted a letter of intent from a company called Meridian Property Group, a Nashville-based real estate developer, to purchase the community center's land at a price that Stella described, with careful professional restraint, as significantly below current market value. The transaction had been fast-tracked through a city administrative process that was technically legal, but had been designed, in Stella's assessment, to move faster than the public could notice. The room was quiet. Lucas was the first to speak. "So, the ordinance was the setup," Stella said. "The code violation, the cease and desist, the arrest, None of it was actually about food storage. It was about building a paper trail. If you can document enough code violations, you can move to have a building condemned. And a condemned building on rezoned commercial land clears the way for the sale to go through without significant legal challenge. She looked at Miss Dot. They were never trying to fine you into closing. They were trying to take the building. Miss Dot did not move. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes on the documents spread across Oscar's table. And she was quiet for long enough that Lucas reached over and put his hand on top of hers. Then she said, "They're coming for Oscar's building." Her voice was low, steady, the kind of steady that costs something. "The council vote to finalize the land transfer is in 14 days, Stella said. "That's our window. If the sale is formalized, our legal options narrow significantly. We need to move before that vote." "What can you do?" Lucas asked. "Tonight I'm filing an emergency injunction to halt the transfer. I'm citing procedural violations in the rezoning process and the subcommittee's failure to provide adequate public notice. It's a solid argument." She paused. "I won't pretend it's a guaranteed win. The injunction will be reviewed by a circuit court judge, and I can't control who gets assigned." "But we try," Miss Dot said. "We try everything we have," Stella said. "And we start tonight." She gathered the documents back into her portfolio and opened her laptop. Lucas made a pot of coffee. Nobody suggested going home. Stella typed. Miss Dot sat at the end of the table with her notebook open, adding to the pages she had already filled. Names, dates, numbers, everything documented in her careful, deliberate handwriting. At one point, without looking up from her laptop, Stella said quietly, "I want you to know something, Miss Dot. I know what happens in this building. I know what it means to this community. I'm not going to let them take it without a fight." Miss Dot looked at her for a moment. "I know you won't," she said. "I always knew what you were made of." Outside, Clover Ridge was dark and sleeping. Sunday morning, Miss Dot opened the community center at 7 a.m. and did not tell a single volunteer what she knew. She just smiled, directed traffic, and fed people. Because that was what the building was for, and they were not taking it. Not yet. Not while she was standing. The ruling arrived Monday morning at 8:47. Stella was already at her laptop when the email came through. She had been up since 5, working through the legal brief she planned to file next. She opened the court's response, read the first paragraph, and set her coffee down. Emergency injunction denied. Circuit Court Judge Alton Ferris, presiding. She read the reasoning. It was written in the smooth, careful language of a man who had learned how to say nothing while appearing to say something. No procedural violations found. Rezoning process deemed compliant. Motion dismissed. Stella pulled up Judge Ferris's public record. It took her 11 minutes to find what she was looking for. A charity golf tournament in Savannah, 18 months ago. The sponsor list included Meridian Property Group. Judge Ferris's name was in the participant roster. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she closed that tab and opened a new one and started building the federal complaint. The Fair Housing Act argument was strong, and she knew it. The community center sat in a neighborhood that was 73% black. Its services, food distribution, GED tutoring, childcare support, were used overwhelmingly by black residents. The forced closure and land transfer would have a disproportionate racial impact that met the federal threshold for review. She filed the complaint with the federal district court by noon. The problem was time. Federal courts did not move fast. They moved correctly, carefully, and slowly. The council vote was in 12 days. She was still at her desk when her phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. It was Big Ray. "You need to hear something," he said. His voice was controlled, but barely. They met at the community center at 4 o'clock. Stella, Miss Dot, Lucas, and Big Ray. who filled the folding chair across from Stella like a man who had been poured into it. He put his phone on the table and played a voicemail from the Hells Angels chapter attorney. Anson had filed a formal complaint against the Hells Angels MC, citing organized intimidation of law enforcement officers. The complaint, filed Friday, the same day the Saturday vigil was being organized, alleged that the charter had engaged in coordinated threatening behavior designed to interfere with police operations. It was thin. It was obviously retaliatory. But it had been enough. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation had opened a preliminary inquiry, and someone inside the Clover Ridge Police Department, the attorney suspected it was Winfield himself, working through an intermediary, had anonymously supplemented Anson's complaint with a tip suggesting the Hells Angels annual charity rides were being used to move money. It was a lie. Every word of it was a lie, and Big Ray said so with the flat certainty of a man who has nothing to hide and knows it. "I know that," Stella said. "The problem isn't whether it's true. The problem is that it's now an active federal preliminary inquiry, which gives them grounds to seek a restraining order. If they get one before the council vote, they keep me out of the room," Big Ray said. "And off the public square." Stella looked at him steadily. "I won't sugarcoat this. They know exactly what they're doing. They saw Saturday, and they understood that the Hells Angels' presence is a problem for them. This is how they're solving it." The room was quiet. Miss Dot had been listening without speaking. Now she said, "What about the injunction?" "Denied this morning. The circuit court judge has a relationship with Meridian that he did not disclose." Stella kept her voice professional. "I've filed at the federal level. Fair housing grounds. But federal courts move slowly, and we have 12 days. So the court is covered," Lucas said. "The bank is covered. And now they're coming after Ray." "That's how a machine works," Stella said. "It doesn't fight you directly. It just puts walls up until you run out of room." Big Ray looked at the table. His jaw was tight. His hands, flat on the surface in front of him, were very still. "I've dealt with people who use systems as weapons my whole life," he said quietly. "Doesn't make me less angry. Just makes me more careful." He looked up. "What do we need?" "We need the public," Stella said. "Before the legal machinery buries us, we need this story in front of enough people that the council can't ignore it. That's our real window." Big Ray nodded slowly. Miss Dot nodded too. That evening, as Stella was packing her files, her phone buzzed. Unknown local number. She answered. "Ms. Glover." The voice was older, male, deliberate. "My name is Jasper Logan. I'm the editor of the Clover Ridge Courier. I think you and I need to meet." A pause. "I have something you need to see." The diner was called Patsy's, and it sat 12 miles outside of Clover Ridge on a state highway that didn't go anywhere important. Jasper Logan had suggested it. Stella had understood why without asking. A man who wanted to meet outside of town, at a place where nobody from Clover Ridge was likely to walk in, was a man who understood that what he was carrying could cause him problems. She arrived first and took a booth in the back corner, facing the door. Logan came in at 9:15, shaking rain off his jacket. He was 66 years old, lean and slightly stooped, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the kind of careful, watchful eyes that belong to people who have spent decades listening for what isn't being said. He had a manila envelope tucked under his arm. He slid into the booth across from Stella, ordered black coffee, and put the envelope on the table between them. He didn't push it toward her. "Not yet. I've been the editor of the Courier for 19 years, he said. "I've covered every city council meeting, every zoning decision, every development deal that's come through this county since 2006. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "I started noticing a pattern about 2 years ago. I put together a file. I tried to run the story 14 months ago." He paused. The paper's owner told me to sit on it. He has a silent stake in 2 commercial properties that Meridian has options on. Stella looked at the envelope. "What's in it?" she asked. Logan slid it across the table. She opened it carefully and began to read. The file was meticulous. 8 incidents, documented in chronological order, each one a separate section with its own supporting materials, copies of code enforcement citations, property transaction records, complaint forms, dates, badge numbers, addresses. Logan had assembled it the way a careful man assembles anything important. Slowly, thoroughly, and without leaving gaps. The pattern was unmistakable once you saw it laid out. 3 black residents in the 4th Street corridor cited by Anson on code violations in the 18 months preceding the quiet rezoning. 2 small business owners, both black, both long established, who had received escalating enforcement actions beginning approximately 6 weeks before their properties changed hands at below-market prices. 1 elderly homeowner, 71 years old, who had been cited 4 times in 8 weeks for minor property maintenance violations before selling and relocating to a cousin's home in Augusta. She had never come back. Miss Dot wasn't the first. She was simply the first who hadn't moved. "These people," Stella said, setting down one of the pages. "Did any of them file complaints against Anson?" "3 of them tried," Logan said. "All 3 complaints are in there. Every one of them was reviewed by Captain Winfield and closed within a week. Insufficient evidence." He said the last 2 words the way you say something that tastes bad. "I've got the closure documents." Stella read for another 20 minutes. Logan drank his coffee and let her. He was a man who understood the value of silence. When she finally looked up, she said, "Jasper, this is enough to bury him." "I know. So why is it still in an envelope?" Logan set down his mug. "Because the man who signs my paychecks told me if I ran it, he'd shut down the paper, and I'd spend the next decade in litigation." He looked out the window at the rain on the highway. "I'm 66 years old. I've got a pension I can't afford to lose, and a wife who's had 2 surgeries this year." A pause. "I'm telling you that so you understand why it took me this long. Not because I'm proud of it." Stella nodded. She didn't judge him. She had learned a long time ago that courage is easier to demand of people than to sustain yourself. "What changed?" she asked. "I watched a 74-year-old woman get handcuffed in a parking lot," he said. "And I recognized 2 of the names in that file as people I had written community profiles on. Good people. Quiet people who just wanted to live their lives." He looked at her directly. "I'm done sitting on it." Stella photographed every page on her phone before she left the diner. She drove straight to the community center. Miss Dot was in the office, and Lucas was in the chair across from her. And Stella spread every page across Oscar's old desk the same way Logan had spread them across the diner table. Miss Dot read in silence. At the 3rd section, she stopped, put her finger on a name, looked up. "Kyla Cooper," she said quietly. "She was at this center every Thursday for 11 years. Then one day, she just wasn't." She looked back down at the page. "I always wondered what happened to her." The room held that for a moment. Then Miss Dot straightened in her chair and looked at Stella with eyes that had moved past grief and arrived somewhere harder and more purposeful. "Jasper still has this file," she said. "He just can't publish it through them." The emergency hearing hadn't been easy to get. Stella had spent 3 days working the phones, calling council members' offices, filing the formal request, navigating the procedural requirements that seemed designed more to discourage than to facilitate. She had been passed between administrative assistants and put on hold, and told twice that the calendar was full. On the 3rd day, she called Councilwoman Karen Lambert directly, outlined the situation in 4 minutes, and mentioned the federal fair housing complaint currently sitting in district court. The hearing was scheduled by end of business that same afternoon. 9 days before the council vote. The Clover Ridge City Hall meeting room held 80 seats in its public gallery. Every one of them was filled by 6:30, 30 minutes before the session opened. People stood along the back wall and spilled into the corridor outside. Miss Dott's volunteers were there. Thursday distribution families were there. 3 pastors from neighboring churches sat in the second row. The 2 NAACP representatives who had been at the police department the evening of Miss Dott's release sat near the front with notebooks open. Big Ray came in quietly through a side entrance with 6 Hells Angels members, all of them in regular clothes. Jeans, plain jackets, nothing that identified the charter. Stella had asked, and he had agreed without argument. They took seats near the back and did not draw attention. They were simply citizens attending a public meeting, which was exactly what they were. Miss Dott sat at the front with Stella beside her, a neat stack of documents between them on the table. The 5 council members filed in at 7 o'clock. Councilman Patterson, the one who had told Lucas these things take time, would not look at the gallery directly. 2 others shuffled papers and kept their eyes down. Councilwoman Lambert and a younger member named Torres looked out at the crowd with expressions that were harder to read. Council Chair Delbert Corson called the session to order. Stella presented first. She was precise and controlled, walking the council through the procedural irregularities in the rezoning process. The timeline connecting Meridian Property Group's letter of intent to Anson's enforcement actions and the federal fair housing complaint currently under review. She kept her language clear and her tone level. She did not raise her voice once. Then she stepped back and said, "I'd like to offer public testimony." Miss Dott stood. The room settled into a particular kind of silence that only happens when everyone present understands they are watching something that matters. She spoke for 12 minutes without notes. 60 years in Clover Ridge, 31 years in the classroom, 19 years running the food pantry. She named numbers, families served, GED diplomas earned in the center's tutoring room, children cared for while their parents went to job interviews. She named the building's history. Oscar's Hands, 1962, the congregation that built the first room together. She spoke about Kyla Cooper without mentioning Jasper Logan's file. She simply said that the community center was the reason some people had stayed in Clover Ridge when everything else told them to leave. She said, "This building has never been about the building. It is about what happens inside it, and I am asking this council to remember that the people who use it every week are not abstractions on a zoning map. They are your neighbors. They are your constituents. And they are watching what you do." She sat down. 3 more people testified. A man who had earned his GED at the community center at age 51 and now owned a small landscaping business. A woman who had brought her children to the center's childcare room every week for 2 years while she worked toward a nursing certification. A retired schoolteacher who had known Oscar Addison since 1959 and described, without sentimentality and with total precision, what the loss of the building would mean to the east side of Clover Ridge. Stella watched the council members. Patterson was still avoiding eye contact, but Lambert was leaning forward. Torres had stopped shuffling his papers. The math was moving. Then Council Chair Corson cleared his throat. "Given the volume of testimony and the complexity of the issues presented," he said, in the practiced tone of a man who has used procedural language as a weapon his entire career, "this hearing will be continued. We will reconvene in 7 days to allow the council adequate time to review the materials submitted." 7 days, 4 days before the vote. Stella kept her face completely neutral as she gathered her files. Outside on the City Hall steps, in the warm evening air, the crowd dispersed slowly around them. When it was just the 2 of them, Stella said quietly, 7 days is not enough time to— "I know," Miss Dot said. She was looking out at the parking lot. They just bought themselves time. She said it without surprise, without defeat. She had been a teacher long enough to know when someone was stalling. And she had been in Clover Ridge long enough to know that stalling only works if the other side stops moving. She turned to Stella. We don't stop moving. 4 days before the council vote, Stella's phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was Big Ray. She knew from the first second of silence after she answered that it was bad. They escalated the GBI thing, he said. She sat up straight. How? Anonymous tip. Came in 2 days ago, apparently. Somebody told them our charity rides are a front for moving money. His voice was controlled in the way a man's voice gets when he is working very hard to keep it that way. It's a lie. Every dollar we have ever raised is documented. Our accountant has records going back 11 years. There is nothing to find because there is nothing there. I believe you, Stella said. That's not the problem. I know what the problem is. The problem was that a formal federal preliminary inquiry, however baseless, gave the city's attorneys legal grounds to file for a protective order. And they had filed. The motion had been submitted to the circuit court, Judge Ferris's court, late Friday afternoon, after business hours, timed so that Stella would have no opportunity to respond before the weekend. Judge Ferris had signed it Saturday morning. The restraining order landed in Stella's email at 7:04 a.m. She read it twice. Reynold Lagman and all members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club were prohibited from appearing at Clover Ridge City Hall or within 500 feet of any City Hall entrance during the period of the pending GBI inquiry. Violation would constitute contempt of court. She called Big Ray back. You've seen it, she said. Yep. Ray, I need you to listen to me carefully. If you violate that order, even if it's wrong, even if it gets overturned later, it gives them grounds to arrest you, and it undermines everything Miss Dot is fighting for. I need you to stay away from City Hall. A long pause. Understood, he said. And then, find another way. She was still at her desk trying to find one when the second call came in. The circuit court had issued its ruling on the rezoning challenge. Judge Ferris again. The rezoning process had been reviewed and found compliant with all applicable municipal procedures. No irregularities identified. The land transfer was cleared to proceed to the council vote as scheduled. Stella set the phone down on her desk and stared at the wall for 30 seconds. The federal fair housing complaint was still active, still real, still legally sound, but federal courts operated on federal timelines, and the council vote was in 4 days, and she knew, with the cold clarity of someone who has spent a decade in courtrooms, that the ruling would not come in time. She drove to the community center to tell Miss Dot in person. She owed her that much. She was still there at 4 in the afternoon when her phone buzzed with a text from Jasper Logan. 3 words. They killed it. She called him immediately. He answered on the first ring and told her in a flat, exhausted voice that the paper's new ownership, finalized 2 weeks ago, a transaction she now understood was not coincidental, had reviewed his draft, confiscated the source files he had stored on the office server, and accepted his resignation effective immediately. He had his personal copies, the ones he had kept at home, backed up on a hard drive that had never touched the courier's network, but the paper itself was gone as a vehicle, and his severance agreement contained a non-disparagement clause his attorney was still reviewing. She told him not to sign anything. He said he hadn't. She hung up and looked across Oscar's desk at Miss Dot. In the space of 9 hours, the restraining order had sidelined the Hells Angels. The circuit court had cleared the land transfer. The federal complaint was too slow, and their only media weapon had been disarmed. Miss Dot had listened to all of it without interrupting. Now the community center was dark outside the office window, and Lucas was sitting in the chair beside her, and neither of them was speaking. The silence was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that comes when people are absorbing something heavy. Lucas reached over and put his hand on Miss Dott's. She looked down at it. Then she looked up at the photograph on the wall. Oscar, 1962, standing on bare dirt in front of a dream. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, so quietly it was almost to herself, "Jasper still has that file?" She looked at Stella. "He just can't publish it through them." The community center office was quiet, except for the sound of Miss Dott's address book. It was an old thing. Dark green cover, spine held together with a strip of electrical tape Oscar had applied sometime in the 90s, and she had never replaced, because replacing it would have felt like losing something. The pages were soft from handling. Some entries were crossed out and rewritten 2 or 3 times as people moved, changed numbers, changed lives. Others had small notes beside them in her handwriting. A star, a date, a single word that meant something only to her. She had carried it for 40 years. It was 9 o'clock at night, 3 days before the council vote. Lucas had gone home an hour ago. Stella was at the other end of Oscar's desk with her laptop open, working through legal options that were growing narrower by the hour. The office smelled like old paper and the remnant of the coffee Lucas had made before he left. Miss Dott opened the address book to the G's. She picked up the phone and began to make calls. The first was to a woman named Helen Grant, 61 years old. Miss Dott had taught her in 1979. Helen had gone on to study journalism, spent 20 years at newspapers in 3 different states, and was now a senior producer at a television news station in Atlanta. They had exchanged Christmas cards every year for 4 decades. Miss Dott called her personal cell, not the station number. Helen answered on the 3rd ring, heard Miss Dott's voice, and said, "I've been watching this story. Tell me what you need." Miss Dott told her. All of it, including Jasper Logan, the file, and the non-disparagement clause he hadn't signed yet. Helen asked 2 sharp questions and then said she would make calls in the morning. The second call was to a man named Alfred Harwin, 68 years old. She had tutored him for his GED in 1984, the year he was released from a 2-year sentence for a crime she had never once held against him, because she understood what circumstances do to young men when nobody intervenes in time. Alfred had eventually put himself through night school, then law school, and now ran a civil rights legal fund in Washington, D.C. that she had read about twice in national publications. He answered his personal line at 9:45 and listened without a word until she was finished. "Dorothy," he said. He was one of the few people alive who called her that. "I've got 2 staff attorneys who can be in Clover Ridge by tomorrow evening, and I've got relationships at the federal district level that might accelerate your fair housing timeline." A pause. "It's not a guarantee, but it's something." "That's all I'm asking for," she said. The 3rd call was to a retired county councilman named Lloyd Spencer from the neighboring county of Brenham. She had met him at a regional educators conference in 1998, stayed in touch because he was a man of genuine principle, and knew from a conversation 6 months ago that he had been watching Clover Ridge's development deals with deep suspicion. He confirmed when she reached him at 10:15 that he had already compiled his own informal record of Meridian Property Group's activity in the region. "I'll make a statement to any journalist who asks," he said immediately, "and I know 2 others who will too." The 4th call was to Jasper Logan. He answered fast, like he had been waiting. "Jasper," she said, "did you sign that agreement?" "No, ma'am. My attorney told me to sleep on it." "Good. Keep sleeping on it." She paused. "I need to ask you something. If you couldn't publish through the paper, if it was just you, your own name, your own platform, would you still publish it?" Silence. Not the silence of reluctance. The silence of a man doing an honest accounting of himself. "Yes," he said. "I would." Then That's what we're going to do. She told him about independent publishing, about the platforms that didn't require an owner's approval or an editor above you or a business relationship with the people you were writing about. Logan was quiet as she talked, and she could hear him thinking. "I'd need to set something up," he said. "Tonight." "I know." A pause. "Can you?" "I'm 66, Miss Dot." "Not dead." The faintest trace of something almost like humor in his voice. "I'll have it ready by morning." She hung up and looked across the desk at Stella, who had stopped typing at some point during the calls and was simply listening. "The restraining order covers City Hall," Miss Dot said. "What does it say about the public square in front of it?" Stella pulled up the document. "Read the relevant section." Looked up slowly. "Nothing," she said. "It only specifies City Hall and 500 feet from any entrance." Miss Dot nodded, like she had suspected as much. "Call Ray," she said. "Tell him to keep his bikes on the public street." Stella was already reaching for her phone. Outside, Clover Ridge was dark and still. 3 days from now, it would be over. One way or the other. Miss Dot closed the address book, set it gently on Oscar's desk, and looked at his photograph on the wall for a long moment. Then she turned off the desk lamp and let Stella work. Jasper Logan published at 6 o'clock in the morning. He had been up all night. The Substack account had taken him 40 minutes to set up. His nephew had walked him through it by phone at 11 p.m. While Logan organized his files into the order he had always intended to publish them. By 2 in the morning, he had the piece written. By 4, he had read it 3 times and changed 6 words. By 5:50, he had his finger on the publish button and was sitting alone in his home office with a cup of cold coffee and 40 years of journalism looking back at him from the walls. He pressed publish at 6 o'clock exactly. The piece was titled 8 Times, a record of Officer Jude Anson and the people who disappeared. It was 11 pages long. Every document was embedded. Every date, every badge number, every property transaction record, every buried complaint. No editorializing, no dramatic language. Just the facts arranged in chronological order. The way Jasper Logan had always believed facts should be arranged, quietly and without mercy. By 7:15, Helen Grant had it. By 8:40, her station in Atlanta had verified 3 of the 8 documented incidents independently, and was cutting a segment. By 10 o'clock, the segment was live. By noon, 2 national outlets had picked up the story and were running their own coverage. At 12:50, a spokesperson for the Georgia State Attorney General's office released a 4-sentence statement confirming the office was aware of the allegations and reviewing available information. Stella read the statement twice and allowed herself one deep breath. Then she called Big Ray. "It's moving," she said. "How many can you have there by 4? "All 50, he said. "Already called them this morning. Public street only. Nothing inside the 500-foot line." "Understood. Ray." She paused. "Thank you." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Tell Miss Dot I said to stand straight." She smiled. She always does. At 4 o'clock, the Hells Angels arrived. They came the same way they always came. Slow, deliberate, the sound arriving before the bikes did. 50 motorcycles. But this time, they cut their engines when they reached the public square in front of City Hall. No rumble, no performance. They parked along the public street in a long, quiet line and dismounted and stood beside their bikes in the afternoon sun. Silent. Within 20 minutes, community members filled the spaces between them. Volunteers from the center. Thursday distribution families. Church members. Former students. The retired schoolteacher who had testified at the hearing. The man with the landscaping business. Gracie's grandmother, standing very still with her hands folded in front of her. Reverend Lucas stood at the center of the square with a portable microphone. He didn't give a speech. He said a prayer, short and plain, and directed at no political outcome, only at truth and the people who needed it. When he finished, the square was absolutely quiet for a moment. The cameras caught all of it. Sean was back on his balcony across the street, live streaming. 3 news vans were parked along the perimeter. Helen Grant's crew was positioned near the City Hall steps. The footage would be on the evening news in 4 states. Inside City Hall, the 5 council members were discovering what it feels like when a phone does not stop ringing. Patterson had reportedly unplugged his office line by 2 o'clock. 2 of the members' personal cell numbers had circulated on social media, sourced to public records, and their voicemails were full before noon. The public comment session opened at 5. It ran for 2 hours. 41 people spoke. Stella submitted the full body of evidence, Logan's documentation, Alfred Harwin's formal legal analysis, Councilman Spencer's written statement, and a supplemental brief connecting Anson's enforcement pattern directly to Meridian Property Group's acquisition timeline. It was the most complete evidentiary presentation the Clover Ridge City Council had likely ever received, and every word of it was on the public record. At 6:50, a woman walked through the public session doors during the final minutes of the comment period. Stella didn't recognize her immediately. Middle-aged, neatly dressed, brown hair pulled back. She walked to the sign-in sheet with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made a decision that cannot be unmade and is moving before she can change her mind. She signed her name and took a seat in the gallery. Stella leaned over to Miss Dot. "Do you know who that is?" Miss Dot looked at the woman, studied her face. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite recognition, but close. "No," she said slowly, "but I think we're about to find out." The council chair called the final speaker. The woman stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked to the podium. She adjusted the microphone. She looked at the council members one at a time, steadily, the way a person looks when they are done being afraid. "My name is Donna Anson," she said. "Jude Anson is my husband." The room went completely still. Donna Anson did not look like a woman who had come to perform. She stood at the podium with both hands flat on its surface and spoke in a voice that was quiet and even, and did not waver once. She had the particular composure of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down. Not dropped it, not thrown it, but set it down deliberately, in exactly the right place. She spoke for 5 minutes and 14 seconds. She described specific conversations. Dates she remembered because she had written them in a personal journal she had kept for 2 years, not because she planned to use it, but because writing things down was the only way she could live with knowing them. Conversations in which Jude had come home late, restless and defensive, and said things he probably believed she wasn't listening to closely enough. He had told her about Winfield, about the calls that came from Winfield before each enforcement action at the community center, about the way Winfield had framed it, "Just apply some pressure, nothing that won't hold up," as though it were routine, as though it were paperwork. He had told her about the payments. He called them goodwill. He said the word the way people say words they have chosen specifically because they are softer than the truth. She had photographed his phone on 6 separate occasions over 2 years. She had the screenshots. They were on the phone in her jacket pocket. She placed the phone on the podium and slid it toward the council. The texts were between Jude's number and a contact saved only as a regional code and 4 digits. Stella would have the number traced within 3 hours. It belonged to the Regional Operations Director of Meridian Property Group. When Donna Anson finished, she picked up her phone, straightened her jacket, and walked back to her seat in the gallery without looking at anyone. The council chamber was silent for 3 full seconds. Then Council Chair Corson said, in a voice that had lost all of its practiced authority, We'll recess until tomorrow morning." The vote was at 9 a.m. It took 4 minutes. 5 council members. 5 votes. Unanimous. The letter of intent with Meridian Property Group was void. A full independent audit of the rezoning process was ordered. The community center's land transfer was halted indefinitely pending investigation. Councilwoman Lambert made a brief statement afterward. Councilman Patterson did not speak at all. What followed came quickly, and it came completely. Officer Jude Anson was placed on administrative leave within 24 hours of Donna's testimony. The Georgia State Attorney General's office opened a formal criminal investigation 3 days later. 3 weeks after that, Anson was arrested in the parking lot of the Clover Ridge Police Department. In handcuffs, walked to a cruiser, the same choreography he had performed on Miss Dot in her parking lot, on charges of bribery, abuse of power, and conspiracy to commit fraud. 2 news cameras were positioned outside. Nobody tipped them anonymously this time. They came because the story had become too large to ignore. Captain Norman Winfield resigned the morning after the charges against Anson were announced, apparently believing that leaving voluntarily would buy him something. It didn't. He was indicted 6 weeks later on charges of obstruction of justice and official misconduct. His pension was frozen pending the outcome. Meridian Property Group's regional director was named in a federal civil fraud complaint. The company's other Georgia projects came under regulatory review. Their investors were not pleased. The GBI inquiry into the Hells Angels MC was formally closed. The restraining order was vacated. The closure letter used the phrase, "no evidence of criminal activity," twice, as though once wasn't enough. Jasper Logan's Substack reached 40,000 subscribers in 7 days. He was offered a journalism ethics fellowship in Atlanta the following month. He accepted. Stella filed the civil rights suit against the city of Clover Ridge 4 weeks after the vote. Alfred Harwin's fund co-signed. Legal observers called it strong. 3 weeks after the vote, on a Sunday morning, the community center opened the same way it always had. Miss Dot was at the door before anyone else arrived, cane in hand, blue blouse pressed. Her good shoes. Big Ray Lagman came through the side entrance carrying 2 large boxes of donated groceries, moving through the hall with the careful attention of a large man in a small space. He had driven over from the shop. He hadn't called ahead. He simply showed up, the way people do when they know they belong somewhere. He handed Stella an envelope on his way past. She opened it. A check from the Hells Angels charter, enough to cover 2 full years of the community center's operating expenses. She looked up at him. He shrugged. "She kept me in school," he said simply. Seemed like the right thing. Across the parking lot, Gracie came running, arms pumping, sneakers slapping the pavement, exactly as she always did. Miss Dot opened her arms and the girl hit her like a wave, and Miss Dot laughed, low and warm, and the sound of it carried across the whole parking lot. Lucas stood in the doorway and watched. Stella stood beside him. On the freshly painted wall just inside the entrance, 2 photographs hung side by side in matching frames. The first was Oscar Addison in 1962, a young man standing on bare Georgia dirt in front of nothing but a plan and a belief that it mattered. The second was Miss Dot, taken 3 weeks ago, standing at the same corner of Red Bud Lane and 4th Street, surrounded by hundreds of people, her arms open wide, the building solid and whole behind her. Between them, on a small oak placard that Lucas had commissioned from a woodworker in the congregation, were 6 words in Oscar's handwriting, taken from the letter he had written to the church when the building was first completed in 1962. For the ones who come after. Miss Dot looked at it every morning when she unlocked the doors. She looked at it now. Then she turned back to her volunteers, squared her shoulders, and said, "All right, let's feed some people." And they did. If you enjoyed the story, Leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.